Welcome to Art Schools Network No More webinar series. We're glad you can join us today as author Jared R. Rawlings interviews Lynn Tuttle, Director of Arts Education with the Arizona Department of Education, on the rationale, emergence of media arts, the writing process, impact, and future direction of the new core art standards. Art Schools Network is an international network of art school leaders and innovators who have been sharing the insight, inspiration, and connections that strengthen arts education for over 30 years. As we start the new school year, we are rededicating ourselves to giving our students the best education and training we can, and we're recommitted to helping you through our networking, programs, and resources. So today, I'm Christy Calloway, your host, and I'm going to be fielding the questions that you'll be sending in, hopefully, to our two special guests, Lynn Tuttle and Jared Rawlings. Just use your chat box over on the right and send us whatever you'd like us to address or comment. We're happy to do so. And please know this recording will be available on our website, free for download and live viewing at your own schedule. So why this interview and why now? Well, the Arts Education Policy Review Journal is a fabulous publication that has been recognized by the Art Schools Network for its research and initiative with presenting discussions about major policy issues in arts education. And we're glad that we could bring one special article out of that issue to you today for those auditory and visual learners. The scholarly article written by Jared R. Rawlings after he interviewed Lynn Tuttle. This is an interview about the core art standards, embracing a new paradigm for arts education, out of the issue, volume 114, issue 3, 2013. Jared, I don't know you that well, but I like you a lot. I think you're a new rock star worth to watch, and we're so glad you decided to write this scholarly article. Could you please introduce yourself and Lynn and tell us the rationale?
Absolutely. Christy, thank you for the opportunity. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Michigan in music education, and when communicating with Lynn Tuttle, who's the Director of Arts Education at the Arizona Department of Education, we were uncovering some really fantastic new information about the National Core Art Standards. So it is definitely a pleasure and exciting to get to talk with Lynn again. Lynn, thank you for joining us. And can you talk a little bit more about the National Core Art Standards and maybe the rationale behind that?
Certainly. Thanks, Jared, and thanks, Christy, for inviting me to be part of this webinar for the Art Schools Network. So let's think about why the National Core Art Standards, and folks can read my bio later, so we'll go on. For those of you who've been following and been active in education over the last 2 to 3 decades, you know that we've had a big standards-based educational reform movement that really burgeoned and came to life in the late 80s, early 90s. For those of you who don't know, the arts were the second out of the gate at the national level as a group of subjects to have a set of national voluntary standards. And what we're doing right now in 2013, 2014 is revising that set of national standards, but this time we're playing catch-up. So while we were just behind the math standards back in the mid-90s, and kind of early adopters and adapters of standards practice, we're now following many of our colleagues. Our colleagues in English language arts and in mathematics have revised their national standards, now called Common Core State Standards. Our colleagues in science just released the next generation science standards in early April of this year. And so we expect to finish the revision work of the National Core Art Standards in 2014. So many of the subject areas have taken this moment in time to revisit and rethink about standards work.
Lynn, before you go on, Jared, I got to jump in here.
Sure.
Someone typed a question about contrasting the overarching focus of the new core art standards with the standards for the arts in '94. I think you're probably going to answer that going forward, but I want to make sure that you heard the question.
Great. So I'm going to give you a bit of a teaser, and then we'll look at the framework in a few slides down the National Core Art Standards. There are one major difference to think about is how the standards are going to be organized. So think of that as a teaser, and then we'll walk you through there and get you there in a couple of slides. Great question. Thanks, Christy.
So we talked about 1994 as being a big date for art standards. Can you talk a little bit about, the coalition of organizations coming to the table to write these new sets of standards?
Great question, Jared. Thanks. So, yes, in '94, it was a coalition or a group of national arts education service organizations that came together to create the standards in art, dance, music, theater. Similarly, this time around, there's a coalition. It's called the National Coalition for Core Arts Standards. Again, the service organizations are present in that work. The National Art Education Association, National Dance Education Association, 2 theater associations, AATE, American Alliance for Theater and Education, and EDTA, Educational Theater Association. Our colleagues at NAFME, the National Association for Music Education, they're all at the table again doing this work. This time the coalition has been expanded to include my colleagues, CDE. Those are the folks who work at state departments of education and focus on arts education. Our colleagues and amazing friends at the College Board who have done extraordinary research to give us a good research basis for the set of standards. Young audiences and their national group and their affiliates. And we'll talk a bit about the work, the incredible work YA is bringing to this in support of a web-based set of standards. And just recently, and this is as in, I got the paperwork signed and on my desk yesterday, so the press release comes out in 3 weeks, people, Americans for the Arts.
Congratulations. What a wonderful coalition.
Yeah.
It sounds like you've got some great organizations at the table writing the very best, in fact.
Yep.
So as we transition to the next slide, unless, Christy, you have a question that you wanted to put in, so what's the relationship between the national standards and then the states?
Right. So why, as someone who works at the State Department of Education, why am I at the table as national standards are being revised? And as many of you, I'm sure, on this call know, national standards are always voluntary in nature. So we lived in a federation where the states actually own the power for education for our public schools. So states either create standards or adopt and adapt a national set of standards, and sometimes we borrow from states across our borders or other places in the country to write content standards. And the states have to adopt standards which then become part of the accountability system for our public schools. So while it's the State Board of Education in Arizona that officially adopts standards on behalf of the state of Arizona, the person you're speaking here, I am the bureaucrat who helps the staffer, who helps make the revision of standards possible. I'm the person who pulls together the teams that creates a set of new standards or revised set of art standards, in this case, to then put in front of the State Board for adoption. So CDAers, we're the go-between. We're the folks who help make the work occur at the state level to get revision and adoption of standards to go forward. And we actually requested that the national standards be updated because we thought that they were that there were pieces that we could glean from an update of national standards that would help us with our state level work.
Okay, so so basically, because we need a model of at the national level for the states to kind of maybe model their standards off of. Is that correct?
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. Great. So that kind of transitions us into as to the rationale for now choosing to revise these national standards. Is that right?
Right. Exactly
okay.
right. So when you think about the national voluntary standards, why do we need to revise them? We did them in '94. The states created standards off of that. We could just keep revising at the state level. But there's real power in coming together, bringing, Jared, as you said earlier, the best of the field from across the country together to do a revision, which then the states can glean great information from. And why are we interested in revising now? So I mentioned earlier, other content standards are in the process of revising. So they got kind of a jump start on us on updating their standards. We need to catch up a bit. There's been extraordinary research, and of course the Arts Education Policy Review has been one of those amazing conduits of research to the field in arts education. We should learn about and learn from that to create a better set of standards. The states have been revising standards over the last 2 decades. What's the great and best practice we can capture from there? And of course technology is a lot different now than it was in '94. Technology is different in terms of what our classrooms look like, and technology is different in how we make, present, perform, produce art. And we really wanted to be able to address that in an updated set of standards. And finally, we needed to think about some of the challenges facing us as arts educators today. We're being called upon in new versions of accountability around teacher evaluation and student assessment to be able to measure student learning in the arts. So we need to step up with a measurable set of standards. We also need to be able to support our colleagues in the field with robust curricular design along with flexibility. And finally, we were imagining what would a web-based set of standards look like that might help teachers, give teachers multiple paths of entering and access into a new set of standards. Those are all the reasons and rationales and wherefores that we thought of when we thought about why should we revise now and why do we want to revise right now.
That's excellent. I mean, technology is not, it's moved from this notion of being a tool to more like a cultural practice and being able to not necessarily use it as a tool, but to just use it as how do we essentially learn, and to use it like that. So when we consider why revising now, there's been maybe a new art form that's emerged from discussions with these organizations. And can you talk a little bit more about this notion of media arts and what it is, and how you guys are preparing the standards to meet that art form?
Absolutely. And yes, huge discussions around media arts. We probably spent 18 months as a coalition of organizations and associations and pulling in media arts experts. What is media arts? How do we want to handle it? What are we going to do with this? And is there a difference between media arts and all of the technology tools that are embedded within each of our art forms? So Jared, you and I are musicians, and there are certainly many new tools at our disposal to help us create music, compose, transpose, orchestrate at our fingertips right now with technology. Is that media arts, or is that just technology embedded in or media tools embedded in music? And so we decided that it's a yes and, that yes, there's technology and tools that are media-based that are embedded in each of the disciplines, but there's also this, and as you said, new art form. I think some folks would say it's been around a while, but perhaps new for us within education to acknowledge of media arts. And there's this wonderful paper on our NCAS wiki space. I'll give you that link toward the end here with a great inclusive definition of media arts. But I really work with Amy Jensen's definition. Amy teaches in the theater and film department at Brigham Young University, and she's just genius. And I understand this, right? So she talks about the historical underpinnings of media arts being film and animation. And think about how many different art forms impress and are part of film and animation, but it has its own aesthetic. It has its own aesthetic value and aesthetic system. Interactive art making is also part of media arts. And here, if you think about gaming, where the audience changes where the art goes, right? And then the one that really hurts my mind, but I have friends who do this type of art making in Arizona, computational art making, where you're writing actual code, software, to create an aesthetic experience. And as I step back as a musician, I see where music has a place and a role in several of these areas, but I also know that I, as a musician, as a music educator, I don't own the aesthetic of these. These are their own artistic spaces. And so we're working on writing media arts standards, and we put together a team of media arts educators and media artists to help us write a set of media arts standards this time around.
See, this is very exciting. I really am intrigued by media arts and what potential it holds in educational settings. So can you talk a little bit more about that on this next slide? You say that how does media arts basically find a home in educational settings? Can you talk a little bit more about that and what the impact is for certification, especially for higher ed teacher education programs?
Absolutely. So it's one thing to create a set of standards, but then who's going to be teaching them? How do we hold them accountable? How do we train them, right, which brings in that institution of higher ed question. And this is all new space for us. So only 2 states in the country that I'm aware of currently have media arts standards. So this is new for the majority of us states in the country. But there's a lot of interest, and that's one reason we're continuing to work on this with the national set of standards. And then what might that definition of media arts as an artistic field look like, and how does it differ from where media arts might currently live, say in a high school setting? It might be in a graphic design class offered through career and technical education, but that might have a very different set of standards than, say, a set of media arts standards. So all of this will need to be negotiated and will be different from state to state. If you think about the that piece of policy work. So in a perfect world, if I got to be queen for a day in the state of Arizona, I would have a set of media arts standards, and I would create a pathway in my institutes of higher education so you could be trained as a media arts educator, and I would simultaneously create a teaching certificate that would allow you to specialize as a media arts educator within the workplace of Arizona K-12 public education. I don't know if such a rational approach will be given to me, or that space given to me in the state. It may be that we place a new set of standards out there. We see who ends up teaching it in the field. We see interest be garnered by the field and by teachers for additional training. We then see institutes of higher ed catching up and starting to build those training programs. And from there, if I can show enough interest, sort of marketplace demand, so to speak, in my state, then I could come up with a new variation on my arts education teaching certificate. So all of this will be in play. It's going to look different state to state, and I look forward to all of us learning from each other about how to make this process more effective, and also because obviously, right, the end game is to get more kids engaged in art making if they're interested in media arts, and help them do that with the underpinnings of standards within a K-12 educational setting.
Absolutely. You speak so well to understand. I mean, gosh, for being a musician, you definitely understand media arts, and it informed me when we initially did this interview. It made me kind of go in deeper into this area and to understand what the possibilities and potential it holds for licensure and for experiences, future experiences for K through 12 students.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be great. You just finished a public review according to your timeline, and can you speak to how this process of revising the standards at the national level has what that procedure's been like and what that timeline's been like?
Great. So the timeline, as outlined on the next slide, it's been a while. So we started work in earnest sort of in fall of 2011. What's kind of fun this time around about doing the national levels, we don't have a timeline dictated to us. Often when we revise standards at the state level, we're given a window of a year to 18 months to get all the work done. So we've been taking our time working on it. It's also really complex if you think about revising a set of standards. And for those of you who do this maybe across a district and look at curricular practice, you always get to really deep conversations about what people's instructional practices are, what resources are available. The same thing happens at the national level, except there's more variability built in, right? So I have trouble, I can't dictate in my state the instructional minutes of practice in music or dance, theater, visual arts in my schools, and it varies widely. So then how do I create a set of standards that will work for all those schools? And then if you take that variation across 50 states, you kind of get what the conversations have been like both for the writing teams and the leadership. What are the staff and time dedicated? So we're thinking about that. And then we added to the complexity on purpose, though perhaps we would have made a different choice 18 months in now, but wanting to get to a web-based set of standards and wanting to embed curricular and assessment supports within the standards. And so that's been a real lift for our writing teams, and bless them, they've really stepped up to the post to do that work. But we really put a lot on them and asked them to think about a lot of those tools and resources as well as the writing of standards.
This is a great segue. I wanted to make sure you saw the question from one of our people, Janet. She asked, how did you define who is the best in the field to get them to contribute to the authorship? And it looks like you're going to address that on this slide.
Absolutely. Perfect timing and great question. So we put together 5 writing teams. This happened in fall of 2011. We put a call out to the field, and we received 450 volunteers. We weren't offering any money, and we told them it was going to take quite a bit of time, and we still had 450 people voluntarily put forward their resume and their application. And from there, we selected 5 writing teams of about 10 to 12 members each, so 1 each for music, dance, theater, visual arts, and media arts. And we had to look at the balance, right? We're handling the complexity of the nation, so we had to make certain that there is geographic diversity, both in terms of the nation as a whole and then in terms of urban, rural, suburban settings. We attempted to get K-12 diversity, so we had to have teachers who had expertise in elementary, middle, and high school. I believe each of the teams has at least 1 higher education person involved, so he's someone with a research and policy and teacher preparation background on the team. And we placed, in addition to those 10 to 12 writing team members, we also placed a state representative to talk about, to make certain that those policy issues that states think about are part of the writing team conversation. So I have to say, you know, the vast majority of the volunteers that put their names forward were extraordinary candidates, and the ones that got selected weren't necessarily any better or the best, but they were the best in terms of representing the diversity of what we needed on those teams. And they've been meeting virtually since January 2012, and we've been fortunate to be able to pull them together where they could meet face-to-face in writing team settings 3 times so far, the latest being earlier this month at the very beginning of August. If you go to the next slide, you'll take a look and you can see sort of the geographic diversity we were able to obtain with those writing teams.
Yeah, all 4 corners are represented. It seems like you all were very thoughtful and intentional about choosing the people that you did for this writing team, and it sounds like from what you're giving, it's a great balance of collaboration with creating these new core art standards. You mentioned a little bit earlier, Lynn, about the curricular and assessment support that you're building alongside of these standards in order to support states and ultimately teachers. So can you talk a little bit more about curricular supports and the Understanding by Design framework?
Sure. So as you'll see on the next slide, we made a choice early on to think about ways to support high-quality curricular practice. And we focused on a model from Grant Riggins and Jay McTighe. We're really pleased to have Jay join us as a kind of unofficial observer and provocateur to the writing teams and to the leadership team. And we embedded in some of his ideas of big ideas. He calls them enduring understandings. What are the big takeaways we want students to have who study the arts with us? What is most important and vital for them to know, right? So that you keep that end point in mind. And here's one of those differences from perhaps the 94 standards, certainly from my current 2006 standards in Arizona, where we kind of dove in head first into, or feet first, into processes, skills, knowledge, what we wanted kids to do. So I've got a ton of music standards in my state that are about, you know, being able to play the B-flat major scale proficiently in 2 octaves. Well, that's great, but why do I need that skill? Right, so I can communicate as a musician. So the EUs kind of help remind us why we do what we do in our classroom every day. And they're to be shared with the students and to be discussed and part of your curricular design and framework and feedback with students. And attached to those are what we call EQs, essential questions, which are ways to help your students in the classroom wrestle with learning about in and through the arts, right? So it could be as simple as asking the question, what is art? But you know what? There's probably more than one really good answer to that. And you might ask that question differently to a group of high school students than you ask it to a kindergartner. So you'll see the essential questions throughout the standards are sort of geared developmentally appropriately to the grade level or the grade band in which they're asked.
Hey, Lynn, this is Christy. A question from Deborah, which is an essential question, I think, is how do you differentiate between design and visual art within the Common Core standards, if at all?
That's a great question. So, and you'll see this in the drafts of the visual arts standards. They have incorporated pieces of design, but they're not taking on that aspect of design head on. They're really focusing in on visual arts and visual artistic processes, which of course include design, right, as part of the process. So you'll see it really flow through their process components and how they've thought about the creation of visual art and the presentation of visual art. And they've been, I think, incredibly, what's the right, neutral about language choices, so trying to move away, it depends on what your state standards look like, right, but not using very specific terminology or IDing a set of specific tools or terminology that may be the flavor du jour for your visual arts in your state or in your district, so that they're not dictating that across the nation. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
So they're handling
Yep.
Yeah,
Go
it
ahead.
sounds more fundamental to me, which makes sense.
Yes.
And then at the same time, like leaving the room for the advanced learning or the sophistication need there open.
Yep.
That's great.
And I have to say that the visual
I'm
arts, the visual arts enduring understandings and essential questions are really beautifully written and should get you to those concepts and that conversation that advanced work around design over time. Sorry, Christy.
No, you can interrupt me anytime because you know more. Okay, the next question I want to make sure our audience gets addressed is from Janet, and she'd like to know how you differentiate between education and professional teaching artists. And I think that she's driving into the pedagogical credentials of those that help set these standards or in general who help set curriculum. And that's probably going to be a big philosophical question. I'm just going to lob it at you. There you go.
Well, thanks, Christy. And you're exactly right. Thanks, Janet, for the question. We had to make that choice, and we did make a choice. We had to make a selection early on. So for the writing teams, we asked volunteers to come forward who are practicing arts educators, who actually practice and live in a classroom, who, bless them, deal with the what can be the craziness of working within an educational setting every day, who have to go to team meetings, who have to work with second grade teachers down the hall, and who have to figure out how to get that performance on the stage that may or may not have air conditioning that day, right? So the folks who practice day in and day out in our schools. When we do the review process, the gates are wide open. We want responses from everybody because we know that while the standards are being written by and the main audience for those who practice day in and day out in K-12 school settings, we also know that standards form the backbone or the skeleton or the support structure for many of the fabulous arts education programs offered by arts and cultural organizations, the supplemental work that teaching artists do when they go into schools and help students dive into depth in their area of expertise. So we encourage, and I certainly encourage, all teaching artists, all arts and cultural organizations and their educational staff and volunteers to review the standards. Can you find yourself in them? Are they going to be supportive of the work that you attempt to do when you engage with students and with schools or bring schools to your space, your performing arts space for a field trip? So they need to work for all of us in this larger umbrella of arts education. They're being written by those folks who own the day-to-day space of K-12 public education.
Fantastic.
Wow.
Awesome.
Are we coming up on a time constraint, Christy?
We are. We have less than
We are?
3 minutes, and I want you to do assessment and all the other remaining
Oh my
slides.
gosh. Lynn,
Well, we're not going to get there, but should we do assessment for a moment?
Let's do a
Yeah,
part
I mean, we can
two.
talk about assessment, or we can just kind of go along what are the next steps and kind of close out. Is there
Great.
a way? Yeah, great.
So all of this information exists on the NCAS wiki space, and I do want to spend just a moment to hang here to look at the framework matrix. These are how these standards are organized. Here's where you're going to see the real differential between the 94 and what will be the 2014 standards, that the disciplines are sharing a mold or sharing a framework by which they're pouring in their standards contents. We've talked about these. The EUs, the EQs are there. You'll see artistic process. How's the process of what we do artistically across the disciplines? And you'll see embedded model, and I mean model, examples of assessment practice. So there's the framework matrix, and let's move on to the final slide that we've got, if that's all right, Jared and Christy.
Sure, that's fine.
Keep
do you
going,
next
Christy.
steps? Or
yeah, we'll go to the next steps, I think.
Next step slide. Okay, great.
Okay, and let's slow down. I don't mind if we go a little bit over just to make sure that we cover all these. So we certainly make sure we get the critical in it within 30 minutes and then go back and spend the overtime, like in football games. We're going to overtime.
We're going to go overtime. Okay, that's
yeah.
fine. So, Lynn, you wanted to talk about maybe the next steps and what's coming up and what you've learned through the review process.
Sure.
Is that what you wanted to discuss? Okay.
Absolutely. So I do want folks to circle September 30th on your calendars. That is when we will put out the next public review of draft standards. This public review will focus on secondary or high school standards. Those standards, if we go back to the framework matrix, is a little complex, but there'll be 3 levels of standards in high school, so you can take a look at that and dive into that a bit more. Just a note, our colleagues writing on the music team, and they are working their tails off, they're writing multiple strands for high school, because if you think about how music is offered in high school or in a secondary setting, there are a variety of ways and paths that are offered. So the draft that will be available for the September review for music will focus on the performing ensembles, and that's any type of performing ensemble, whether a traditional, what would be traditional in Arizona, band, orchestra, choir, or something that is still emerging as a field here in Arizona, something like African drumming, world drumming, gamelan, mariachi. So any sort of performing ensemble where you put people together, students together to perform, you should be able to find yourself within this set of performing arts, performing ensemble strand, from music.
That's good. So people who just do that in high schools can look to the performing ensemble strand, and that kind of guides their review on September 30th.
Yep. Starting September 30th, and we'll keep it open for about 2 to 3 weeks. So come on, come all.
Great. So the next steps, other than reviewing opportunity, or the reviewing opportunities, we're looking at how do we encourage and support quick adoption at the state level.
Right, and it's a great point. So our hope, our timeline will have the final version of the national standards completed in March 2014. One of the big rollouts will be for the visual arts standards at the National Art Education Association conference at the end of March in San Diego. So for the visual art teachers out there, put that on your calendar and come join your visual arts colleagues, because they're going to spend a lot of time looking at those national standards at that point. But yes, you're exactly right, Jared. If you remember way back to the beginning, national standards are voluntary until they get adopted or adapted and adopted at the state level. So the work really begins in earnest starting in April of conversations in your states. Do we want to adopt a set of national standards? What might we want to change that is specific to our needs as a state? Do we love them as they are? Do we want to change them a bit? And then what is the process? Again, every state has a different or has variations of adoption process. So in Arizona, we go through State Board of Education. Some states like New Hampshire, standards are actually approved through their legislature. So you need to figure out what the process looks like at your state. And if you're not certain, feel free to visit our website, or if you want to learn more, and be in contact with your CDA representative. And our website's www, it's on one of the slides, .cdae.org. Oh, there we are. So check in, see what's going on, and please give us feedback. These standards are meant to be your standards, so we want to hear from you, and we encourage you to participate in as many of the reviews as possible.
Well, it's really certainly been a pleasure to talk to you again, Lynn. It's good to hear your voice and to hear your excitement in this process and getting these new core art standards off the ground and hopefully quickly adopted by states as they hold a lot of potential meaning for student learning over the course of the next few years. So, and just for getting more information out there about the art, and thank you for participating today in the webinar.
Great. And Christy kindly put up there links where you can go learn more. So I encourage you to go dive into media arts, look at some of the amazing research that the College Board has done on which this set of standards is based, and continue to follow the progress on our wiki space. Christy, any other questions we should answer?
I'm not sure Christy's with us. Well, maybe she is. She's...
There we go.
Okay.
Christy, any other?
I had myself on mute. Yes, there are no more questions. I was just talking away there.
No, it's all right.
We're going to continue this conversation online through our webinars and at our conference. We hope you'll join us. We want to thank both Lynn and Jared for joining us today and giving us the insights. In fact, I think we're going to have them back to tease some of those pieces out and go deep. Thank you both, and we hope that all of you have a happy new school year.
Yes, thank you all for joining us.
Lynn. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, this is the end of the No More Webinar series. Goodbye.